Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I hope you're ready, because today we are not just wading into the shallow end of the pool. We are jumping straight into the abyss.
Yeah.
We are taking a look at a conversation, or really a series of extensive multi-hour conversations that just, well, it breaks every rule of polite political discourse.
The abyss is probably the most accurate description I've heard for this material.
Right.
We're looking at a massive collision today. It's a meeting of minds between the Hodgetwins, those viral comedic conservative commentators.
The Yeah Guys.
The Yeah Guys, exactly. And Nick Fuentes.
And for those who only know the name Nick Fuentes from, say, headlines or maybe from that infamous dinner at Mar-a-Lago a few years back, how would you even characterize him? Because the media portrays him as this sort of cartoon villain, a neo-Nazi boogeyman. But when you actually watch these tapes, the reality seems, it's a lot more complex, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Look, Fuentes is arguably the most controversial figure in modern American politics, bar none. He calls himself a Christian nationalist. He's labeled a white supremacist and an anti-Semite by, every major watchdog organization, from the ADL to the SPLC. He's been systematically deplatformed from almost every financial and social media institution in the Western world.
Every single one.
And yet, here he is, sitting down for hours of completely unfiltered, raw dialogue with two Black conservative icons.
And that is exactly why we're here. We aren't here to endorse a single word of this.
No.
We aren't here to debate them in real time or tell you what to think. Our mission today is to really unpack the worldview that's being presented in these tapes. We want to understand the arguments on censorship, race, geopolitics, and theology that are driving this very specific, very loud, and very polarized subset of internet culture.
Precisely. To understand the current political landscape, you really have to look at the edges, not just the center.
That's a great point.
The center is static, the edges are where the friction is, but, and this is a massive but, we need to issue a pretty strong disclaimer right up front.
Yeah, we have to.
The source material we are covering today involves highly politically charged and sensitive topics. We're talking about explicit discussions on race and IQ, allegations of anti-Semitism, graphic descriptions of violence, and some very radical theological interpretations.
Right. We are reporting strictly on what was said in the source material. We're holding up a mirror to the conversation, so you, the listener, can see exactly what is being argued in these spaces without the filter of a 2-minute news clip or some biased article. We're going to strip away the noise and look at the signal. What are they actually saying, and why does it resonate with their audience?
Yeah.
So if everyone is buckled in, let's start with the man himself. Nick Fuentes claims to hold a very specific, very ominous title.
The most banned man in the world.
Right.
That's how the episode opens. And he's not just talking about, losing a Twitter account or getting a temporary suspension for a spicy meme. He paints this picture of a life lived under a total digital, financial, and physical siege.
Let's talk about the physical aspect first, because this was one of the most jarring stories he tells right out of the gate. I think most people assume being canceled just means you lose your job or your Twitter account, but he claims there was a legitimate assassination attempt.
He does, and the details are... well, they sound like something out of a slasher movie or just some bizarre piece of fiction.
Yeah.
He lays it out like this. He was in the middle of a live stream doing his show from his home studio when he hears screaming outside his house.
Okay.
Now, for Fuentes, harassment is apparently par for the course. He mentions, eggings, people yelling from cars, that sort of thing. It's the price of fame in his world. But this was different.
How so?
He finishes the show, goes downstairs, and his producer is standing there, white as a sheet.
Wow.
The producer tells Nick, "Don't go outside. Do not open that door." It turns out there is a man standing in his driveway armed with a gun and a loaded automatic crossbow.
A crossbow.
Yes.
Like a tactical weapon. That feels incredibly medieval.
Yes. An automatic crossbow with a magazine plus a .22 pistol.
Uh-huh.
This wasn't a hunting accident. The guy was geared up. But the weapon isn't even the darkest part of the story. It's the assailant himself.
Who was he?
Fuentes claims this individual had committed a triple homicide in southern Illinois earlier that very same day.
Wait. So this guy allegedly kills 3 people and then drives, 2 hours?
Drives 2 hours specifically to Fuentes' house, bypassed everyone else to get to Nick. And when the police arrived, it turned into a war zone in a quiet suburban neighborhood.
I can't even imagine.
According to the account, the police engaged the suspect. The suspect ran into a neighbor's yard, broke into a house, killed the neighbor's dogs, came back out, shot at the police, and was eventually shot and killed by the officers.
That is a massive news story. I mean, a triple homicide suspect targeting a political figure with a crossbow. You'd think that would be on every channel for a week. That's breaking news banner material.
And that is exactly Fuentes' point. His grievance isn't just that it happened, it's how it was covered. Or rather, how it wasn't. He says the media reported it as an alleged assassination attempt, or they simply buried the connection to him entirely. They treated it like a random act of madness rather than a targeted political hit.
He plays the comparison game here, right?
Yeah.
He says if the roles were reversed.
He does. He argues that if the racial demographics were reversed, if he were a prominent black activist like Al Sharpton or a BLM leader, and a white triple homicide suspect showed up with a crossbow, it would be the defining story of the year.
Oh, absolutely.
We'd be talking about National Guards, task forces, maybe even legislation.
So he views this silence, this lack of coverage, as proof of his status.
He uses it as his first piece of evidence that he's a political target who the system effectively wants dead. He believes there's a media blackout designed to dehumanize him to the point where violence against him doesn't even register as news.
It's as if the system is saying,
he's a villain, so whatever happens to him doesn't count.
Yeah, and the silencing goes beyond the media blackout. He talks about what he calls the no-fly list of banking. Now, I've heard of people losing PayPal accounts for violating terms of service, but he describes something that sounds much more systemic.
He describes a complete financial exile. We're not just talking about losing a specific app. We're talking about being banned from PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, Cash App, and most major consumer banks.
Wow.
He gives a specific example that really highlights the mechanics of this, and it's fascinating from a purely economic perspective. He started selling America First hats, his brand. In one night, he makes $50,000.
$50,000. That's a huge success for an independent creator. That's a career-making night.
It is, but the next day, the payment processor freezes the funds. They don't just hold it, they reverse it.
They send it all back.
A week later, they refund every single transaction to the customers and tell them they can't do business with him. He loses the money, the sales, the data, everything. It's a total wipeout.
Unbelievable.
And he argues this isn't just individual banks making risk decisions. He blames the cartel.
And by cartel, he means the credit card companies. Visa and MasterCard.
Exactly. Visa and MasterCard. This is a crucial part of his worldview. He argues that because they control the rails of the global economy, the actual infrastructure that moves money, they have veto power over every bank in the system.
I see.
So even if a small local bank wants to take his money, Visa or MasterCard can step in and say, if you process his payments, we will cut you off from the network.
That's terrifying if you think about it. It's essentially being cut out of the economy without due process. There's no trial, no judge, just a toggle switch in a server room somewhere. It's digital exile.
Exactly. He frames it as a social credit system that is already here. He says he's been unpersoned. He can't use Uber. He can't use Airbnb. He can't hold a bank account in his own name. He is forced to operate almost entirely in cash or through, complex loopholes. He's living like a fugitive in his own country.
It's interesting how he maps this timeline of censorship, too. He notes that this wasn't always the case. He traces a very specific history of the internet.
Right. He's very nostalgic for, 2015. He says back then, censorship was rare. The internet was still the Wild West. You could say what you wanted. Memes were flying. And nobody was getting banned for hate speech in the way they are now.
And then the change came.
Then he identifies the period from 2017 to 2021 as the peak of the censorship regime. This is when the clampdown happened, banning people for opinions on elections, vaccines, the war in Ukraine.
But he claims there's been a shift post-2022, a sort of thawing.
Yes, and he credits two specific things, Elon Musk and TikTok.
Okay, Elon Musk buying Twitter, now X, is obvious. He reinstated a lot of banned accounts, including Fuentes for a time. But TikTok, that's surprising. Usually conservatives hate TikTok because of the Chinese connection. You hear about spy balloons, data harvesting.
Fuentes flips that on its head. His theory on TikTok is fascinating. He argues that because ByteDance is a Chinese company, they don't care about enforcing American political correctness. They don't care about hate speech definitions created in Silicon Valley or by the ADL. They just want engagement. So ironically, TikTok became a free speech haven by accident, simply because it wasn't beholden to the U.S. political establishment.
That is a wild take. The idea that a Chinese surveillance app is the bastion of American free speech because they just don't care about our cultural taboos. It's a very cynical geopolitical way of looking at it.
It shows how fluid his thinking is. He looks for cracks in the system. But even with his return to X, he's skeptical. He talks about this concept of control opposition.
Okay.
He doesn't trust that he's just being let back in because of benevolence.
He thinks it's a trap.
Oh,
or a management strategy.
He thinks it's management. He believes that when the establishment can't silence you, they try to infiltrate or co-opt you. He uses J.D. Vance as his prime example of this infiltration.
The current vice president.
The very same. Fuentes points out that J.D. Vance was a never-Trumper back in 2016. Vance is on record calling Trump Hitler and a rapist.
I remember that.
Then, Vance realizes he needs Trump to win a Senate seat in Ohio. He brokers a peace deal with Peter Thiel and Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and suddenly he's the heir apparent to the MAGA movement.
And Fuentes doesn't buy the conversion story. He doesn't think it was a real change of heart.
Not for a second. Fuentes sees this not as a conversion, but as a hostile takeover. He views Vance as a representative of the system, Yale law, venture capital, Peter Thiel wearing a MAGA mask, to neutralize the movement from within.
So to him, real opposition can't be successful in that way.
He argues that true opposition is always poor, banned, and hated. If you are being celebrated and elevated to the vice presidency, in Fuentes' view, you have compromised. You've taken the deal.
Speaking of masks and compromised figures, that brings us to the second major segment of this deep dive. You simply cannot talk about Nick Fuentes without talking about the Ye era, the time he spent with Kanye West.
The Ye 2024 campaign, this was a surreal moment in political history. You had the biggest rapper in the world, arguably the most famous cultural icon of the 21st century, teaming up with Nick Fuentes and Milo Yiannopoulos. It was like a fever dream.
And of course, the Hodgetwins ask him about the most infamous moment of that run.
Yeah.
The Alex Jones interview, the one where Ye wore the mask.
The black fabric mask that covered his entire head. No eyes, no mouth, just a silhouette.
I remember watching that live and just thinking, what is happening? Why did they do that? It seems so self-destructive.
Fuentes defends it. He argues that the shock value was necessary. He claims that to get attention for the forbidden topics they wanted to discuss, specifically their praise of Hitler and their criticism of Jewish power, they had to do something visually arresting. They had to break the simulation.
So it was a strategy.
If he just went on there in a polo shirt, maybe people listened to the words. But with the mask, the entire world stopped to look.
But beyond the stunts, Fuentes paints a picture of Ye that is actually strangely admiring. He describes the scene inside Ye's studio, and it sounds like absolute sensory overload.
It does. He describes a massive warehouse. And the walls aren't just walls, they are giant LED video screens. And on these walls, Ye is playing The Matrix, Star Wars, and the video game The Last of Us simultaneously on a loop.
While working. All at the same time.
While working. Fuentes calls him a symphony conductor. He says Ye would work from 4 a.m. until midnight nonstop. He'd be chopping beats in one corner, approving fashion designs in another, and dictating political strategy in a third. All in the same room, all at the same time, bathed in the light of these movies.
That sounds incredibly intense. It sounds exhausting.
Fuentes pushes back hard against the media narrative that Ye is crazy or having a bipolar episode. He describes him as lucid, high energy, and incredibly hardworking. He sees Ye as a true visionary who just operates on a frequency that normal people, and certainly the political establishment, cannot understand. He calls it genius energy.
But then there's the swastika incident. This was a story I hadn't heard before, and it really peels back the curtain on how they view race and image.
This is a very revealing anecdote. Apparently, Ye wanted to wear a T-shirt with the swastika on it.
A literal swastika.
Yes.
Not a stylized one, but the actual symbol.
Yes. And Fuentes, the man who was constantly accused of being a neo-Nazi, the man who calls himself a white nationalist, was the one who was terrified.
But he was scared.
Yes. He says he was thinking, I'm a white guy. If I wear a swastika shirt, I am done. I will never live this down. The optics are suicidal. It's game over.
That's ironic. The white supremacist is the one saying, whoa, that's too far.
Exactly. But Ye's rationale was different. Ye believed that as a black man, he could get away with it. He thought he could repurpose the symbol. He believed his celebrity and his race gave him a shield that Fuentes didn't have. He wanted to take the most radioactive symbol in history and just wear it.
And did he?
Fuentes describes Ye peacocking in front of the paparazzi in the shirt, standing tall, chest out, almost daring them to take the photo. It highlights the strange dynamic where you felt he was above the rules of political correctness in a way that even Fuentes found too dangerous to touch. It speaks to Ye's belief that he could rewrite reality just by force of will.
That leads us directly into the most volatile part of these conversations, the discussion on race, crime, and society. The Hodgetwins and Fuentes do not hold back here, and they get into some very specific, very charged arguments about interracial violence.
This is where the disclaimer we made at the start is most relevant. We're analyzing their arguments, not validating them.
Right.
They structure this part of the conversation around a concept of interracial conflict. They bring up the case of Austin Metcalf.
I'm not familiar with that name.
And most people aren't, and that's part of their argument. Austin Metcalf was a white student who was stabbed. They contrast his case with the case of Daniel Penny.
The Marine on the subway.
Right, the Marine who placed Jordan Neely in a chokehold on the NYC subway. The Penny case was massive. Everyone had an opinion on that.
Of course.
So they frame these two cases as a no-win situation for white men in America. That is their core thesis here. They argue that a white man faces a binary choice when confronted with potential danger from a black individual.
Okay.
Option A is the Daniel Penny route. You defend yourself, you neutralize the threat, but then you go to jail, you get charged with manslaughter, and you are branded a racist by the global media. Your life is ruined by the legal system.
And option B?
Option B is the Austin Metcalf route. You don't defend yourself, perhaps out of fear of being called a racist, maybe out of hesitation because of the social conditioning, and you end up dead.
So it's a track.
They argue that the social cost of being called a racist has become so high that it is literally disarming white people in life or death situations. They call it a psychological disarmament.
And the Hodgetwins, who are black men, seem to largely agree with this assessment. They don't push back on this racial framing. In fact, they pivot to sharing their own stories about segregation and where they choose to live.
This was a really surprising part of the dialogue. The Hodgetwins openly discuss their desire to live away from black neighborhoods. They admit they moved to a predominantly white neighborhood specifically for safety, but then they tell a story about their car getting broken into.
Right. They check the Ring camera footage.
And they see it's black teenagers. The teenagers stole a checkbook from the car, and this leads to a specific incident of banking fraud that the Hodgetwins used to illustrate their point about competence and culture.
Okay.
A check was cashed for $5,000, and the name written on the check was John Smith.
John Smith. That's the most obvious fake name in the book. It's like something a cartoon character would use.
Exactly. And the Hodgetwins were incredulous that the bank teller accepted it. They described dealing with the bank claim and the attitude of the black bank teller who handled it. They felt she gave them attitude, rolling her eyes. Maybe because she recognized them as conservative commentators or maybe just general incompetence. But they used this anecdote to reinforce their belief that, in their words, they don't want to live around black people because of the crime and the cultural issues they perceive.
It's a very raw, uncomfortable admission. They're essentially arguing against their own demographic based on their class and cultural preferences.
They are. And Fuentes takes us a step further. He moves the conversation from culture to biology.
Oh, boy.
He argues that the differences in crime rates and achievement are not just cultural or socioeconomic, but genetic. He goes full biological determinism. He does. He explicitly lays out a hierarchy. He claims that Asians and whites have higher IQs and lower propensities for violence compared to black people. He argues this is why their civilizations look different. He says, and this is a quote, "You can't have a first world country with a third world population." He views civilization as a direct output of genetics.
And the Hodgetwins don't push back. They don't say, hey, wait a minute, we're smart, we're successful.
No, they actually affirm it with their own experiences. They talk about their upbringing and what they call the natural hostility they were taught to have toward white people growing up. They view their own community struggles as self-inflicted or culturally ingrained, and they seem to accept Fuentes' premise that there are innate differences.
That's a really strange dynamic.
It's a fascinating, if disturbing, psychological dynamic to watch two black men nodding along as a white nationalist explains why their race is genetically predisposed to violence.
They also touch on the Great Replacement theory, this idea that demographic shifts are intentional.
Yes. Fuentes uses a very vivid analogy here to explain why he thinks white people are upset about immigration. He asks the listener to imagine a hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
What if Canada and Mexico conspired to flood Texas with Muslims?
Okay. That's a specific image.
Imagine they flooded Texas with millions of Muslims with the specific goal of displacing the native Texan population and giving the state to the new arrivals. He says, that's what happened in Palestine, and that's what's happening in America. He frames mass migration not as a natural economic flow, but as a hostile act of conquest designed to destroy the existing population. He calls it demographic warfare.
It's a heavy, dark worldview. And it doesn't stop at race. They pivot to gender, and the conversation gets pretty cutting regarding the 19th Amendment.
The women's vote. Their argument here is stark. They believe the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was the beginning of the end for American society.
Because women vote for Democrats.
That's the statistical part of it. They cite the fact that if only men voted, every state would be Republican, and if only women voted, every state would be Democrat. But the reasoning they give is psychological. They call women suckers.
Suckers. That's a direct quote.
That is a direct quote. They argue that women are biologically wired for empathy and are easily manipulated by sob stories. They claim women lack the male capacity to call out bullshit. Because women prioritize safety and security over liberty, they naturally vote for big government, welfare, and open borders. Anything that sounds nice or safe.
So they view the state as becoming a nanny state because the electorate has become feminized.
Exactly. They argue that you cannot have a rugged free republic if the majority of voters are prioritizing safety over freedom. And then Fuentes uses the alarm clock metaphor. This was creative.
Describe that.
He references a viral video where a mother is screaming while a coyote drags her child away. In the video, she isn't physically fighting the coyote, she's just screaming.
I think I saw that. It was horrifying.
Fuentes argues this is biological. He says women are nature's alarm system. Their job isn't to fight the threat. Their job is to scream loud enough to summon a man to handle the threat.
So when women are in charge of politics?
In his view, you have an alarm system trying to run the security detail. He argues it leads to a society that runs on emotion and fear rather than logic and strength. They also take a swipe at modern media, criticizing The Last of Us and the Minecraft movie for depicting women as physically dominant warriors.
Right, the girl boss trope.
They see it as a complete inversion of natural reality. They argue that Hollywood is trying to reprogram biology by showing 110-pound women beating up 200-pound men, and they think it's creating a generation of confused, weak men and delusional women.
Let's shift gears to the other massive pillar of this conversation, geopolitics. Specifically, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. This takes up a huge chunk of the dialogue, and frankly, it's the glue that holds a lot of Fuentes' theories together.
It is. And this is where Fuentes' America First ideology really transforms into something much more specific. His core thesis is that the U.S. government is effectively occupied.
Occupied.
He doesn't use the acronym ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, explicitly in these clips, but he describes the concept in detail. He argues that Zionist interests control U.S. foreign policy through financial dominance.
He names names, too. He's not vague about this.
No, he points to donors like Miriam Adelson and Bernard Marcus. He argues that politicians like Trump, Biden, and Speaker Mike Johnson are all beholden to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. He claims that you cannot become a high-level politician in America without bending the knee to these financial interests.
So he sees Congress as
a board of directors for Israeli interests, not as a representative body of the American people.
And he frames the current conflict in Gaza in very stark terms.
He refuses to call it a war on terror. He calls it ethnic cleansing and genocide. And to support this, he highlights the rhetoric coming from the other side. He brings up tweets from Randy Fine, a Republican politician endorsed by Trump.
What did the tweets say?
They were graphic. Fine referred to Palestinians as human animals and demons. He called for no mercy and openly mocked the death of Palestinian children. Fuentes uses this to say, look, they aren't hiding it. They are telling you they want to wipe these people out and the U.S. is funding it.
He also brings up a document from 1996 called the Clean Break Report. Now, hearing him talk about it, it sounded like a conspiracy theory, but I looked it up. It's a real document, isn't it?
It is absolutely a real document. A clean break, a new strategy for securing the realm. It was a policy paper commissioned by Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996. The authors included people like Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, and David Rumser.
And why does Fuentes cite it? Why does a 1996 paper matter in 2024?
Because those same authors, Pearl, Faith, Wormser, later became key officials in the George W. Bush administration.
Ah, there's the connection.
Right. The report outlined a strategy for Israel to secure its borders, not by peace treaties, but by destabilizing its neighbors. Specifically, it called for removing Saddam Hussein in Iraq, containing Syria, and eventually confronting Iran.
So Fuentes looks at the Iraq War.
And he sees the clean break memo in action. He argues that the Iraq War, the chaos in Syria, and the current tensions with Iraq were all pre-planned strategies written by Zionists to serve Israeli interests, not American security. He says American blood and treasure were spent to fulfill a foreign policy wish list drawn up in 1996.
And he thinks war with Iran is next, that it's the end goal.
He thinks it's inevitable. He argues that Israel cannot defeat Iran alone. Iran is too big, too powerful, and has too many proxies. So he believes Israel is manufacturing provocations, bombing the Iranian embassy in Syria, assassinations in Tehran, specifically to drag the United States into a direct war with Iran. He warns the listeners that the Trump administration, filled with what he calls neocons, is being set up to pull the trigger on this war.
This political critique bleeds right into his theology. And this is the part that I found most surprising. The intensity of the religious argument. I think a lot of people assume the anti-Semitism is just racial or economic, but for Fuentes, it's deeply spiritual.
It is the foundation. He attacks the term Judeo-Christian,
which is a staple of American conservative rhetoric.
Yeah.
Our Judeo-Christian values.
Fuentes calls it an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. He argues that Judaism and Christianity are theological opposites.
He talks about supersessionism. What exactly is that?
Right. It's the theological belief that the Christian church has replaced Israel as God's chosen people. Fuentes argues that the old Israel was a biological lineage, but the new Israel is the body of believers in Christ. Therefore, modern Jews have no special covenant with God and certainly no divine right to the land of Palestine.
But he goes darker than just theology. He brings up the Talmud.
This is where he gets into very specific, graphic, and historically anti-Semitic tropes. He claims that the Babylonian Talmud contains passages that are explicitly hateful toward Jesus and Mary.
What specifically does he allege?
He claims the Talmud describes Jesus as a sorcerer. He claims it refers to Mary as a whore. And most graphically, he alleges that the Talmud states Jesus is currently in hell, boiling in a vat of excrement or semen.
That is incredibly specific and grotesque.
It is. And whether or not those specific translations are debated by scholars, Fuentes uses these alleged passages to argue that modern Judaism is not just different from Christianity, but actively hostile to it. He quotes the Book of Revelation, referring to the synagogue of Satan, to argue that there is a spiritual war between the two.
And he critiques the Christians who support Israel, the Christian Zionists.
He calls them brainwashed. He blames the Schofield Bible, a version of the Bible popular in the early 20th century that popularized the idea of a future restoration of Israel. He blames Fox News. He argues that American evangelicals are worshiping a people who, in his view, hate Jesus, and they are doing it because they've been misled by bad theology and media propaganda. He essentially calls them cucks for a foreign religion.
This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the red pill. We hear this term all the time, but Fuentes defines it in a very specific way.
He goes back to the source, the matrix. He says taking the red pill isn't just about becoming a Republican or a conservative. It's about realizing that the entire world you live in is a manufactured simulation.
A simulation, like nothing is real.
He means the narrative. He argues that mainstream media figures, and he explicitly names people like Ben Shapiro and Tim Pool, are not genuine commentators. He calls them actors playing a game. He compares it to The Truman Show.
The moment where the boat hits the wall.
Exactly. The moment you realize the sky is painted and the people are extras. Fuentes argues that these media figures are funded by foreign interests, whether it's Israel or whoever, to keep the American public within a certain pen of acceptable opinion. He argues that the red pill is the terrifying realization that the people you thought were on your side are actually managing your dissent.
And he suggests there's a hierarchy of knowing.
Yes. The idea that the deeper you dig, the more the official narrative falls apart. He references 9/11, WWII, the USS Liberty. His argument is that intelligent people, if they are intellectually honest, will inevitably find these forbidden truths. He positions his worldview not as hate, but as the inevitable conclusion of asking questions and refusing to accept the blue pill of comforting lies.
It's a lot to take in. It is a dense, interconnected web of conspiracy, history, theology, and sociology.
It is, and it's a worldview that is gaining traction because it offers a unified theory of everything. It explains why the banks banned you, why the culture feels alien, why foreign wars never end, and why the media seems to lie. It ties it all into one single antagonist, and that simplicity is incredibly seductive to people who feel lost or angry.
So we've unpacked the assassination attempts, the banking bans, the collaboration, the racial theories, the gender wars, the geopolitical conspiracies, and the theological battles. It is a view of the world that is fundamentally adversarial.
It is a worldview that says, you are being lied to, you are being replaced, and you are being occupied. And the only solution, in their eyes, is a radical break from the current order.
So what does this all mean for us, for the listener? What's the takeaway?
I think it means we have to understand that this isn't just trolling. This is a sophisticated, self-reinforcing ideology. When mainstream institutions fail to address legitimate grievances like unequal media coverage or debanking without due process or endless foreign wars, they create a vacuum.
And someone steps in.
And figures like Fuentes step into that vacuum with answers. You don't have to like the answers to understand why people are listening to them.
That is the crucial point. If the simulation is breaking, as they claim, what reality replaces it? Good times create weak men, they say. But what kind of men do these times create?
That's the question. If the current order collapses, what rushes in to fill the void? Based on this conversation, the alternative they propose is authoritarian, racially segregated, and theologically rigid. It's a stark choice.
A stark choice indeed. This has been a heavy, deep dive, but a necessary one to understand the currents moving beneath the surface of the internet.
Absolutely. Knowledge is the only way to navigate it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.
And stay critical. See you next time.